Why do we learn scales? What are they actually for? Okay, because they're the foundation of music, because they're what makes up music, right? And if we want students to get that first, improv is a better entryway to that. And if they understand what it's for and that they can improvise with it, make their own music, understand pieces better with it, compose their own pieces using it, it's much easier to get them to then practice the scales and drill them in the way that they need to with those fingerings, because they get the purpose behind them intuitively because they've experienced it.
You're listening to the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast from Top Music. Tune in weekly as we interview music teachers and experts from around the world to explore creative activities and ideas that build learning connections in students. Our integrated music teaching approach will deepen your students' understanding of musical concepts, engage them in critical thinking, improve their reading and performance, foster their curiosity, and prepare them for a lifetime of music making. Tim Topham here, and welcome back to the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast from Top Music. It's great to be with you for another week. I just love recording these episodes and interviewing people and putting together this content for you. It's really always uplifting and exciting, and love the feedback that you guys do share with me from time to time, either as comments on our show notes pages or on our social media channels. As I've mentioned a few times in the past, it's always fantastic to get reviews for the podcast. So if indeed you are getting value from this podcast and would like to share your comments, it just takes a few seconds. You can either do it through your podcast app or head over to topmusic.co/review. It'll only take a minute or two, and I really do appreciate it. And it does mean that we can tend to get in front of more and more teachers and help share our love of teaching and improving teaching and creative teaching with more teachers around the world. Well, in this episode, number 318, we're going to be discussing how to make scales fun, interesting, and relevant for students with the amazing Nicola Cantan. Nicola's been on the show a few times, so I'll make her introduction very quick. Nicola is a piano teacher, author, blogger, and creator of imaginative and engaging teaching resources. She loves getting piano students learning through laughter and exploring the diverse world of music making through improvisation, composition, and games. Nicola's vibrant music teaching membership site is helping teachers all over the world to include more games and off-bench activities in their lessons. It's a pleasure to have you back. Nicola Cantan, it's so great to have you back on the podcast.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe how long it's been since I've been here, but great to be back.
I know, we've been following with interest all the amazing things you're doing over at Vibrant Music Teaching and Colourful Keys. And I should have checked really before we started this episode, but I think you've probably been on as a guest maybe 4 or 5 times, and you've hosted as well. Would that be about right?
Yeah, it's hard to count because I 1 or 2 like takeover shows as well. So I don't know. Yeah,
that's right. So today we're going to be talking all about scales. We've got a focus this month on our blog all about exams and music exams, preparation for exams, and looking at all the different aspects that come together for that. Now, of course, scales aren't just an exam thing to do. Hopefully, most teachers will realise there's merit in doing scales. Where should we start? What do you think the best place is when we're teaching scales?
Yeah, so I like to start scales in a bit of an unusual place that most people don't start them. I start all my students' first introduction to scales is with improvisation. So before they ever meet a fingering or even talk about the word scale, they're meeting these patterns through improvisation.
Okay. And so are you doing those in particular keys?
Yeah. So I have a course on my site called the Circle of Fifths Odyssey. That's basically what I do. And it's what it sounds like. We go on a journey around the Circle of Fifths. So we do one key every week pretty much. And then at the end, we do like all 12 back to back. So you get this, few bars in each key going around the Circle of Fifths. So we spend sort of 1 week on each key. And we're just introducing them to each new key by saying, okay, so this one needs 1 extra sharp. So instead of this white key, you play this black key. It's as simple as that. It doesn't have to be about scale fingerings or even, as I say, worrying about them knowing that it's a G major scale or that we're in the key of G. We use those terms, but we're not expecting them to retain all of the terminology at that stage.
Okay, I want to come back to that because that's actually, you've kind of blown away some teachers straight away because most of us would go, all right, well, the exam syllabus suggests we need to learn G and E minor for this grade, or we're learning pieces in those keys. So I'm going to teach you the scale of G major. So why not just say, here's the scale of G major and this is the fingering?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I used to very much do that. I mean, I was an exam-based teacher at first because that was all I knew. And so I literally took what was on the exam syllabus and drilled those with my students in the lead up to the exam. And then whatever was on the next syllabus, that was what they learned next. And I realized they weren't really learning these scales. Like they weren't learning anything from this. They didn't understand what scales really were or what they could do. So there was no motivation, therefore, to learn them. So the improv first idea is about saying, hey, why do we learn scales? What are they actually for? Okay, because they're the foundation of music, because they're what makes up music, right? And if we want students to get that first, improv is a better entryway to that. And if they understand what it's for and that they can improvise with it, make their own music, understand pieces better with it, compose their own pieces using it, then it's much easier to get them to then practice the scales and drill them in the way that they need to with those fingerings because they get the purpose behind them intuitively because they've experienced it.
I talk about this in my integrated music teaching model where you're looking at an element of music. So let's say key, and we're trying to make connections with students that they're going to understand. And so we could say to a student, and in fact, this is better than what a lot of us were taught. We could say to the student, did you know that the music that you're playing, the notes of the piece of music you're playing come from the scale? And sometimes that's not even a connection that's made for students. It's like, here's a scale, just learn them. They're good for your technique and scale passages are going to come up in pieces. So you'll be able to play them. But I think I 100% agree about this improvising thing. And for me, that's the integration. So you've gone, okay, the connection is, yes, scales and melody are connected. Scales and key are connected. But how could we give them an experience that they're going to remember, that's going to be memorable and novel and create a bit of emotion around the fact that melody comes from scales? Well, how could we do it? We could do some improvisation in that key. I think it's foundational and so important to help students understand that, because otherwise, they, as I did, they're just a technical skill you have to learn, like something you have to do, right?
Yeah, and you're told they're for technique, but like I played scales for many years with terrible technique, so like they're not for technique unless you actually teach technique and then reinforce it through the scales. Like unless you're focused on that as a teacher. Scales don't teach technique. There's nothing magical about them. You could learn technique through pieces just as well. What they can teach us is all these common patterns and the theory behind it and these connections within music. So if you start to understand why you're even teaching them in the first place, as I always try to do, like look at something that we're just doing one way by default and say, why? And is that the right way? And in this case, I decided, no, like that shouldn't be the purpose behind them. That doesn't make sense. So.
And how have your kids responded to that? When did you make that change, by the way?
Oh, it's been quite a few years now. I'd say 5, 6, 7, something like that, where I've really focused on improvising, say in their first year of studies. And then maybe in year 2 or, for the younger students, it might even be year 3, they're meeting proper scales for the first time. Yeah, it's really changed how a lot of them look at scales. I'm not going to say all of them love practicing scales at that later stage. Like that would be patently false. But if I don't hate teaching them, which let's be honest, a lot of us do when we're just like, we ask them to play their scales. We're leading up to an exam, so we're stressed about their progress with them. And we know it's not going to go well. Like we know they want to practice it. So it's this awful feeling going into it. And you're deluded if you think you're managing to disguise that to students. You're just not. Like they can pick up on this tiny cues that say, this is a thing that's not fun or not cool, or I just have to do it because I have to eat my greens,
Yeah.
So yeah, when you don't have that attitude going into it, I think that makes an enormous difference. And I'd say about half my students genuinely like scales. Like when I say, okay, we're ready to move on to a new scale, they say, great. It really
Well,
happens.
that's a win, yes.
Yeah. And then, yeah, there are those who need a bit more drilling, but no one detests them in the way that I used to encounter, where they just groan at having to do them. So there's that. And then there's also just the pleasure of doing the actual improvisation. Like that has value in and of itself, that they get to experience that, because I have this pattern that also makes it easier for me as a teacher to not miss the improv every week, you know, because it's just a default warm up or in the middle of the lesson, whenever you want to do it. But it's like, I did see last week, I'm going to do G, I'm going to do D, I'm going to keep going because I've already started down this track. So it sort of commits you as well to doing this regular improv, which is really valuable.
Mm. And so do you tend to work, I think you mentioned earlier on, you'll start with 1 sharp, move to 2, so you'll go to G, to D, to A, etc. And is there, when they're playing and improvising, are you giving them scale fingering, or can they use whatever fingers they want, or do they break up the scale in 2 hands?
No, they use whatever fingers they want, and really I leave it up to them. So if, like, we're starting this almost right from the beginning of lessons, so these would be students who, in their reading pieces or in their rote pieces, at first they're still playing with 1 finger, you know, because we're focusing on building up that arm weight movement. And then they might start using a few fingers. I really let it develop naturally themselves, and I don't correct what they're doing in that. It's really just free exploration. I'm working on their hand shape and their posture and all of that elsewhere in the lesson. But during that time, I really want it to be about exploration and getting comfortable with these patterns and getting comfortable with the idea of playing white keys and black keys and a mixture, and nothing about that is hard, you know?
So when do you start the whole, all right, thumb goes under here and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so that's almost...
proper scale fingerings.
Proper scale fingerings. So that's almost completely a separate decision to all this improv stuff for me. So as many people will know, we teach a lot of younger beginners here. So it largely depends on when the student starts and how their technique develops. I don't start scales until a student is playing legato with something else, you know, a reading piece or a technique exercise elsewhere, comfortably without tension. Otherwise, I'm not starting scales. They are not going to teach legato for me. There's something that happens when you can already play legato nicely, which gives you a better running start at scales as well, because students aren't just completely stumbling over the whole thing in the beginning. And I think that helps a lot with this, them not thinking of scales as this like drudgery. Because when you do start them too soon, they're too hard. And so it takes like 2 months to learn the C scale. And of course they hate it because it's so boring and it's been going on so long and it's still so hard. So yeah, it's about, can they play comfortably legato? And with a 4-year-old, that might be year 3. With an older student, it might be month 3, month 1. I mean, it doesn't matter to me. It's about when can they handle the technique involved.
I think that's just really great to hear, because we now know from the research, and we look at all the modern methods, and they all say detached, non-legato playing is the best for beginners. And we've both taught that for some time. And so I think it's great to then hear what you're saying. Until they can comfortably play, what would you say, 3, 4, 5 notes legato without tension, don't start them on scales. Because I think it's really easy for teachers to go, okay, I'm not doing the method book stuff legato, but I'm doing scales at the same time. It could be done too early, and then we get the flying fingers and the tension and all that kind of stuff. So I think this aligns so well with what the research says about the importance of non-legato playing at the start. Have you come across the same kinds of things in the methods that you're using?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have to give huge credit to Piano Safari for really solidifying this for me and making it into this easy to follow journey of technique for me that then was backed up by so many other people. But for teachers out there who are thinking, what? Non-legato first? Like, if you're listening and thinking that was me several years ago. It was everyone started somewhere. So maybe check out Piano Safari as a method if you want to explore what that's like to teach technique that way. But yeah, I would definitely say it's very helpful to have the two things aligned together and they get what legato is. And it also, I think another reason teachers introduce scales earlier before the student is playing legato elsewhere or anything is because you feel like, oh, my students are always behind on scales and I want to get a head start this time. And I've tried that approach. Like, believe me, I've been there. I've been the test subject. It doesn't work. You don't get a head start. It just takes longer and they drag out. And like I say, students end up thinking that scales are really annoying. So yeah, delaying them actually helps you go faster is what I found.
Mm. Is it worth talking about Hannon exercises and Schmidt and those 5-finger patterns? Do you see merit in those? And if so, at what stage?
Okay, I don't use them. And that's not because I think they are useless. It's because it was never really a part of my teaching and I haven't found a gap that they would help fill. What I do is like with particular repertoire, if students are having trouble with a particular pattern, you know, a pattern of thirds or something like that that's causing their fingers a bit of a finger twister, we'll design a little pattern exercise that focuses on that thing, solving that problem within that piece. So that's sort of where people might be using Hannon in some cases. But I never really did them growing up. My teacher was into Czerny, which is very different, really. They're really just little pieces. You know, they're not really technique exercises in that way. So I have nothing against Hannon, but I would come back to the same thing I said with scales. You can play Hannon with bad technique or good technique. So you have to teach the technique and then use whatever you're going to use to reinforce that.
And let's be honest, repetitive activities, moving in similar motion at an early stage can induce tension. There's no doubt about it. So I think, again, proceed cautiously is probably the best way to do it. So you mentioned introducing scale fingering. I think we all probably agree that C major is one of the harder scales to play because you've got no black note references. And I know Chopin, of course, was the big exponent of B major should come first, I think he said, or D flat major, the ones that are easiest to play. How do you approach that? And how do we get out of the habit of starting on C major?
Yeah, so as I kind of said, the improv does start on C major because obviously that is the easiest visually when your student is allowed to just use one finger and use whatever free fingering they like, right? They can just hop around and, you know, I'm accompanying them. I should have said that earlier. I'm accompanying them with a chord pattern. So I have the pedal going. So it all sounds magical and wonderful, no matter what they play. But when it comes to actually introducing the scale fingering, personally, I start on G flat for a similar reason to the whole starting on B thing. But I think G flat is even easier to remember and has the same advantages in terms of your hand shape, you know, sitting with your middle fingers. For those who haven't heard this argument, by the way, it's that the shape of your hand, you've got 3 longer fingers and then essentially 2 shorter ones, right? The baby finger and the thumb are the short guys. So if you have your 3 longer fingers sitting up on the black key, that's a lot more natural and comfortable with the other 2 sitting down on the white keys. So it's a good relaxed position to begin with. I like to start with G flat because, as I say, I think the fingering is even easier to remember. You haven't got the whole, hey, start on the 4th finger in the left hand thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also just apparent why that fingering makes sense. Like, when I first introduced the scale, I actually introduced it just with my student playing with one finger again, going up now. So I talk a lot in solfa, so I'm telling them to play the pattern do, re, mi, fa, so, etc. And they find which white keys they're going to use and which sound right. So we start from sound first. And then I say, okay, well, if we're going to play it legato smoothly, what fingering could you use that would connect all those notes? And a lot of students will come up with the answer by themselves. It's that apparent because there's 3 black keys. You got 3 fingers that make sense.
Fingers. Yeah.
Yeah. Then you put your thumb on the white key. Even if they don't get it themselves and I have to show them a little bit, they immediately get why I suggested that as an option. And they never forget how it should go. Like, it just doesn't happen. So that's why I start with G flat. And then I do D flat after that to give further reinforcement of like, hey, there's 2 black keys there to start. So obviously these fingers make sense. And then I start jumping around a bit. So then I go to C.
Right.
After that, because I want them to then meet that like most common fingering. So they get used to that. So we do C and then G, and then we go back into the flats and do A flat, and then we go, so we kind of jump around like that. But yeah, I start with the G flat to D flat as a friendly, gentle introduction.
And least friendly, would you agree, is probably B flat?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you want to get to that somewhere in the middle, in my view. You don't want it to be first, because that is just like a trial by fire. That's awful. But you don't want it to be last, because they will never learn it.
So, and I think it makes sense too that you go to C fairly quickly, because the other thing that a lot of teachers are keeping in mind is that, well, one, they may be doing exams, and the exam grades do not start with G flat major. They start with C and F and E minor. And secondly, the students are playing pieces in those keys, the simpler keys most likely. And so it's good to, well, I think it's good to align the scales with the music they're playing on the most part. It's helpful, as you say, because the melody connects to the scale, connects to the key. So when we're getting ready for an exam, do things change in your studio? Does the ruler come out and it's like, no, grumpy Nicola's here because we're going to learn these fingerings?
No, obviously not. What does change is we now have to focus on the scales that come up on that exam. And they're not going to go in the same order that I teach in my studio. So besides just starting with the G flat thing, I start by working my way through all 12 major scales, and then all 12 minors, natural minors, which don't come up on exams, and then doing the harmonics from there. So we're trying to get as far with that as we can before they have their first exam, if they have their first exam. So they will have covered quite a lot of ground. But there are some things that will come up on the exam that we haven't done yet because of the order they're coming up in. So what I like to do with exams, very simple system with the exam scales. You have a big long list. And in our booklets, I thought I had one beside me. But anyway, the way the list is laid out is quite confusing for students to follow. Like, it's not that, it's fine for an adult, but for a student, they don't really see how many scales there are, because it kind of goes major scales, 1 octave, colon, this list, like C, G, D, A. And then it goes the next thing. And there's nothing wrong with that. They're saving space in their book. Like, I get what they're doing. But for students, I like to lay it all out as a big long list. So I have that set up in Google Sheets that I can just copy paste it. And then I split it up into 3 groups. So each group includes a little bit of each category, you know, a few major scales in similar motion and contrary motion and minors and arpeggios, etc. A few of each key, and then the next group has a few of each again, and then the third group has the final ones. So trying to split up, like, there are some harder ones in this first group and some in the second group and some in the third group. And then, yeah, we go through them practicing like that. I find that's more manageable, just splitting up into 3 groups rather than looking at the full list.
Yeah, I used to always create a table. Yeah, the exam syllabuses are quite confusing, and you don't want to make a mistake and forget something as a teacher either, because that's so embarrassing. So yeah, making a table, and I used to have a checklist that they could kind of tick off as they learnt them and things like that too, which can be helpful. Okay, so I'm really keen to get on in a second just to some practice ideas, because I know you are just full of super creative, fun ideas, and I want to talk about those. But just one thing, if a student is kind of stuck and they're struggling with a particular scale, are there any sort of go-to tactics that you've got?
Yeah, so these would be, they'll overlap with my general tactics. I have a whole list of different ways of practicing the scale. The first thing I would say, though, is if possible, give your students access to videos of the scales being played, whether you find those. Some of them are covered actually on my YouTube channel, so you can look them up there. And then others, I have videos of all of them in the membership. So I attach those into Nara for my students so they know exactly how it goes, and there's no excuse. There's no like, oh, I just forgot it.
Forgot how it went.
There's a whole video. So yeah, if there is one they're struggling with in particular, even if you don't usually do the whole video thing, make sure you've sent them a video so they don't have this constant confusion about it. I do all my scales without written music, so they wouldn't have that to refer back to generally. Yeah. And then if they are struggling with it, we just do a really intense session on practicing that in lots of different ways. And also try to use it to break up everything else in your lesson. So if you go through scales at the start and they just aren't getting F major, well, then you do F major between every single other thing you do in your lesson. You keep coming back to it. So this is kind of a way of almost not quite doing interleaved practice of that. So you're splitting up all the other assignments with it. It'll help with the other assignments because it's kind of a break away from them for a sec. And it will help with that scale because you're forcing them to remember it. You're forcing their brain to call back that memory again and again and again, not just doing it once in a big block and then them not practicing when they get home and trying to do it the next day and having completely forgotten it.
That's right. I've definitely written about interleaved practice, so we'll try and find that and put a link in our show notes for today. Okay, well, let's wrap things up and summarize with some tips. I think you might have some app suggestions maybe, and yeah, what kind of ideas have you got for the teachers?
Yeah, sure. My biggest app suggestion is going to be, well, first of all, for the improv one, an app that I know you've mentioned a lot, Tim, is Music Lock, which is really fun for improvising, for them to do at home, for having great backing tracks.
So it's Music Lock, MUSICLOCK, Music Lock.
The other one I would suggest is very simple, and again, one you've brought up before, but some kind of drumming app. So there's one called Drum Loops, there's Super Metronome Groovebox, or if you're sitting out there and you're like, I don't have an iPad, I don't want a tablet involved in my lessons, that's fine. There's a thing called YouTube, and you can just search drumming track 80 BPM, and one will show up, I promise you. So
fantastic.
You don't have to have anything fancy. But yeah, having a drummer going is going to help them to play regularly and with a bit more music rather than just using a metronome. Metronomes are great sometimes, but having a drummer helps them to treat their scales more like they're actually little bits of music, musical. Which they should be.
Yeah, that's a good tip.
Yeah. And then once you got that going, you need lots of different ways of practicing things, because what you're trying to do is not let them kind of go to sleep during playing the scale, right?
Yeah, you don't want them to switch the autopilot on. They've got to stay focused on it.
Exactly. Yeah. And some students will do that even while making a bunch of mistakes. Like it's just too boring. It's not challenging them enough. And so they switch off and they actually make a bunch of mistakes and then they're just practicing mistakes. So lots of different ways of practicing. The most common one everybody always says is dotted rhythms. It's an oldie but a goodie. So practicing the scales in dotted rhythms. You can have them
kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And then you can practice them without touching the piano. So things like having them say all the notes in the scales without touching the piano. Say all the fingering in each hand without touching the piano. Or if you want to go more advanced without looking at the piano, have them turn around. That's way harder.
I'm trying to think, could I do left hand of B flat harmonic minor like that? I think I
could, but that's because, it's because of correcting students. Yeah. That's where you get really, really good at the scale fingerings more than playing them yourself. So things like that, or having them lay out like little erasers or something on all the keys they're going to play. So they're combining, like visualizing it and really laying it out, seeing the pattern of tones and semitones or whole and half steps, playing in various different rhythm patterns. So one really fun thing to do is take one of their pieces and maybe take a rhythm pattern that they're struggling with or that's tricky in that piece and then apply that to the scale.
Ah, great idea.
So they get extra practice of that rhythm pattern. And it's also so much more challenging for them to play the scale.
Yeah, I really like that one. That makes so much sense because, again, you're making connections. You're connecting two parts of their lesson together. Have you tried, I've tried this a few times, getting the student to play with just one finger, particularly as this, C major is easy, obviously, but again, B flat minor, I don't know why I keep going back to that one. What's another nasty one? A flat minor is not much fun. Yeah, trying to do it and make no mistakes by using one finger, always a challenge.
You know what's the most fun?
What's that?
That with contrary motion 2-octave scales. That's a good way to torture your students.
So what am I doing? 2 octaves contrary.
2 octaves, one finger of each hand. Yeah. And if you want to be really annoying, just make them use like finger 5.
with a nice shape and no tension. Wow. That would actually, I've never tried doing that. I wonder if people listening are going, I'm going to pause this and go and try it right now. See if I can do it.
Yeah, you should. And make sure you can do it and like at speed so you can kind of show off to your student. They'll think it looks kind of cool if you can do it well.
And that grand scale form of the scale's become quite common now, I think, where you go up 2 octaves, out 2 octaves, up 2 octaves. It used to be a bit rarer, but I think most teachers are using that now. And I think you're right. That sort of simple combinations of mixing up rhythms, anything to keep them concentrating, I guess. Mixing up rhythms, playing in different octaves, different separation between the hands, 2 octave separation sometimes. What about do you do polyrhythms? So quavers in one hand, triplet quavers in the other kind of thing? That's a mind bender.
That's fun to do. It's also fun to do with the arpeggio in one hand and the scale in the other. So the faster one, make that the scale. So like triplets and then even just crotchets to begin in the left hand as an arpeggio. It sounds cool and it's kind of a bit wacky, but it's fun.
There you go. Still learning new things. That's very cool. I haven't tried that one. Cool. And then we've got the apps, and you could combine any of those with apps as well. I remember my teacher used rhythms, the dotted rhythms, triplet rhythms. And you can also use them in pieces as well, where there's scale motion passages too. Any other ones before we wrap things up? Because I don't want to give people too many ideas, but I know that there's so much fun that you put into your lessons.
Yeah, I'll give you 2 more, but I will preface this with my very oft said little phrase, which is just do one thing, J dot. So please just do one thing. Take one thing from this. You don't need the whole list initially.
Did you say J dot?
Yeah, that's what my abbreviation for just do one thing for teachers who get really overwhelmed. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I definitely say the same thing. 100%.
Absolutely. Okay. So 2 more. My next one has to be, again, to just make it more musical. Try having them sing along. So you can have them sing along in solfa is what I really like. Or you can sing the note names. It's a bit awkward, but that can kind of be good for reinforcing, or sing the finger numbers from what's really fun is sing the finger numbers of one hand while you play the other hand.
You're cruel.
Everything is about making things more difficult so that they're concentrating. That's what this is all about. So if you go into it with a little bit of a giggle. I think
you're kind of enjoying the terror.
No, it is. But you need to explain the logic to them as well, which is this is creating desirable difficulty. It's helping you to learn better, faster, because it's so difficult. So it's supposed to be impossible. If you kind of preface it with that, with your students, it's really helpful because they don't feel like, I'm just crap. I can't do this. They feel like, oh no, it's supposed to be really hard. Like it's hard on purpose.
Use the phrase creating desirable difficulty. Is that something you've created? I've never heard that before.
No, I didn't create it. I'm not sure who did. I've heard it several places, including the book Making It Stick. And also a lot of the work by Greg Goodhart, if you know him.
No,
we talk about desirable difficulty. You can look up his videos on YouTube and stuff. He works a lot. He does like practice masterclasses with musicians. So he's just helping them come up with better practice strategies that are based on, how the brain actually works.
Right.
Rather than just tradition.
Just repetition. Yeah.
Yeah.
Creating desirable difficulty. I like it. I'm going to look that up.
Yeah, do. Everyone should. It's really important. So that's really what we're doing here. And I think it's important to understand the why behind things like playing in different rhythms that we've all been told to do is because you're making it harder. That's what you're doing, is making it a little bit harder so your brain has to focus in a new way and create stronger neural pathways. I said I would give 2 more ideas, so I'm going to give 1 more. This one I love doing, and I had a student yesterday say she loved doing it, but I've also had students groan at me. So, use it as you like. But it's where you play 1 note of the scale, and then 2 notes of the scale, and then 3 notes of the scale. So you play do, re, mi. No, sorry, do, re mi, fa. And you keep going until you've played the whole scale.
It's like that choir warm-up. 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 2,
Yeah.
1. It's like the choir warm-up.
It's similar. Yeah, but you're just doing 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're not going back down. But if it's like a 4-octave scale, obviously that takes a while.
Yeah. And so this is reinforcing, isn't it just reinforcing though the start of the scale and less at the top?
Yeah, so you wouldn't want to do this exclusively for sure. You also, it can be really useful to do this, but starting at the top, if students just always make mistakes on the descent.
They turn around, yeah.
Yeah. All of these things are about mixing it up. So you don't do that with every scale every time. You just try it occasionally. What I think it tends to help students with is speeding up. Because when you're playing just 1, 2, 3, you can do that quite fast. So they build up more facility for playing them at speed, that when they're playing the whole thing right off, they tend to go, they hopefully go at a sensible pace that they can actually do. But I find this helps with building up speed sometimes.
Great. Well, you've definitely given me some new ideas and some new phrases and words to look up. So thank you very much, Nicola. You're actually presenting in more depth on these topics at 2 conferences in America this year. So do you want to tell us quickly about those in case people would like to check that out?
Yes, absolutely. I'm presenting the same presentation basically at MTNA, which is at the end of March in Reno. It's called Super Fun Scales and Terrific Technical Drills. And I'll be doing that at MTNA in March and then at NCKP this summer in July.
In Chicago.
Where Tim will also be, I think.
Yes. I can't wait to catch up with you and all friends that we haven't really been able to see in 3 years. So in fact, I just booked my flights today. Yay. So yes, come and hang out with us in July in Chicago. It's going to be a great conference. And you can also find out all about Nicola over at vibrantmusicteaching.com. And your blog is Colourful Keys.
Colourfulkeys.ie.
.ie. Fantastic. Thanks so much for joining. Thanks so much for joining me today, Nicola. It's great to see you.
Thanks for having me. Such a pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's interview with Nicola and got some new ideas for your studio. And hopefully we'll both see you at NCKP in Chicago in July. If you can make it over there, it'd be wonderful to hear about it. Let us know either as a comment on our show notes at topmusic.co/episode 318 or over on any of our social media channels. It'd be great to hear from you. That's the end of the show for this week. Until next week, I'm Tim Topham and you've been listening to the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast. Look forward to catching you next time. How do you keep up to date with all the latest trends and research into music education? How do you connect with other teachers around the world and make sure your teaching stays fresh and relevant for students of all ages and stages both now and into the future? I created our Top Music Pro membership to be the one-stop shop for music teaching resources, training, support and community, and I'd love for you to come and join us inside. With over 40 comprehensive training courses, hundreds of teaching demonstrations and lesson plans, free monthly sheet music, discounts and all the business and pedagogy support you could ever need, Top Music Pro is the community you've been looking for. If you're ready to level up your learning from the podcast and join thousands of other teachers in our global network, head over to topmusicpro.com today. If you enjoy this show and want to hear more of our work, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening today. For links and resources mentioned in this episode, visit us at topmusic.co/podcast or check out the show notes. I'm Tim Topham and this is the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast, a production of Top Music. Thank you so much for listening, enjoy your week ahead, and I'll catch you next time.